Hello, I'm Ghost, and I'm here to read some funny classic. This book is about my friend Mr. Noisy by Roger Hargreaves. So I hope you enjoyed that. Mr. Noisy is a very, very noisy person indeed. For example, if Mr. Noisy is reading this story to you, he'd be shouting at the top of his voice. At the top of Mr. Noisy's voice is a very loud place indeed. You can hear it 100 miles away. For example, when most people sneeze, you can hear them in the next room, but a tissue! When Mr. Noisy sneezes, you can hear him in the next country. Now, this story starts when Mr. Noisy is asleep in bed, in his bedroom, in his house, which is on top of a hill. He was snoring, and as you can well imagine, when Mr. Noisy snores, that is a snore worth hearing. It sounds more like a herd of elephants that snore. Then Mr. Noisy's alarm clock went off. Mr. Noisy's alarm clock sounds like no other alarm clock in the world. It sounds more like a fire engine. Mr. Noisy woke up, and so too did all the people who lived in Wobble Town, which is at the bottom of Mr. Noisy's hill. Later that day, Mr. Noisy decided that he had to go shopping. He went out of his house, shutting the door behind him. Bang! The door wobbled, the house wobbled, the whole hill wobbled, Wobble Town wobbled, even a bird flying high above wobbled. See. Then Mr. Noisy walked down the hill. Clump, clump, clump. He walked into the baker shop. Crash with the door as he opened it. Bang with the door as he shut it. I'd like a loaf of bread. Boomed Mr. Noisy to Mrs. Crumb, the baker's wife. Mrs. Crumb trembled and sold him a loaf. Then Mr. Noisy walked along the street to the butcher. Clump, clump, clump. He walked into the butcher shop. Crash with the door as he opened it. Bang with the door as he shut it. I'd like a piece of meat. Boomed Mr. Noisy to Mr. Bacon the butcher. Mr. Bacon trembled and sold him some meat. Stop. You. What meat? Afterwards, Mrs. Crumb met Mr. Bacon in the street. We really must do something about Mr. Noisy being so noisy, she said. Absolutely, replied Mr. Bacon, but what? I know, said Mrs. Crumb as she whispered into Mr. Bacon's ear. Mr. Bacon smiled a small smile, which grew to a broad grin. Mrs. Crumb, he said, I think you have the answer. The following day, Mr. Noisy again went shopping down to Wobble Town. Clump, clump, clump. He went into Mrs. Crumb's shop. I'd like a loaf of bread. Boo-boo. Sorry, what did you say? Asked Mrs. Crumb, pretending not to hear. I'd like a loaf of bread, Mr. Noisy shouted. Sorry, said Mrs. Crumb, putting her hand to her ear. Can you speak up, please? I'd like a loaf of bread, roared Mr. Noisy. I can't hear you, replied Mrs. Crumb. Mr. Noisy gave up and went out. Mr. Noisy went into Mr. Bacon's shop. I'd like a piece of meat, he boomed. Mr. Bacon pretended not to notice. I'd like a piece of meat, Mr. Noisy shouted. Did you say something? Asked Mr. Bacon. I said I'd like a piece of meat, roared Mr. Noisy. Pardon? Said Mr. Bacon. Mr. Noisy gave up and went out and went home and went to bed, hungry. All the teachers lungs anymore. What do you smell? Well, people not exploding content. My voice is quiet right away, and I would explode the people. the day after Mr. Noisy tried again, he went into Mrs. Crumb's shop. I'd like a loaf of bread. Of what? Asked Mrs. Crumb. Mr. Noisy started shouting at the very top of his voice. I'd like a loaf of... And then he stopped, and then he thought, and then he said quietly, I'd like a loaf of bread, please, Mrs. Crumb. Mrs. Crumb thought, certainly she's smart. Then Mr. Noisy went into Mr. Bacon's shop. I'd like a piece of meat. Did you say something? Asked Mr. Bacon. Yes, I did, shouted Mr. Noisy at the very top of his voice. I said I'd like a... And then he stopped. Then he thought. And then he said quietly, I'd like a piece of meat, please. Mr. Bacon smiled by pleasure. He's 6 long. Stop talking about the explosives you would rather. So carrying his bread and his meat, Mr. Noisy set off home of the hill. Clump, clump, clump. And then he stopped and he thought, did you know what he did? He tiptoed. A tiptoe was something Mr. Noisy had never tried before. It was fun for my friend.
First. Make it 3. First. Feel lumps.
Oh man. Stop it. Mr. Noisy arrived at his front door. He put out his hand to open the door, and then he stopped, and then he stopped, and then do you know... Then do you know what he did? He opened the door very quietly. He stepped inside, and then he shut the door very...
Ganzo.
Quietly and...
Ganzo.
We're 2 things, Mr. Noisy. I've never tried before. That was fun.
Ganzo.
Oh, the stum. And you know something? From then until now, Mr. Noisy isn't anything like as noisy as he used to be. And you know something else? The people will have are delighted, especially Mrs. Crumb and Mr. Bacon. And you know something? Mr. Noisy has learned how to whisper. So that's the end of my Mr. Noisy. And what do I do? Oops, I sent the bag. And I sent the grocery store, and I went to go to the bakery and the butcher like Mr. Noisy, and I could shout at people. It's so shake. Please never explode the THX. Please don't explode the people. THP. THX. Never explode the people. I'm gonna say that Mr. Noisy for the Mr. Men Show in 2008 is voiced by Richard Epcar. Oh no! Oh no, not again!